The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a scent that usually carried an air of formality, gravity, and respect. But today, for Daniel Thompson, the atmosphere felt suffocating. He walked into the room, a formal suit pressed neatly over his shoulders, tie straightened, and shoes quietly tapping against the marble floor. Every step he took should have been measured, professional, poised. Yet his stomach churned with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and the subtle sting of humiliation. Daniel had come here for a serious matter, a dispute involving property and inheritance, a situation that demanded composure, not theatrics. But the moment he entered, his eyes met the sight of his daughter, Emily, seated on the front row. And she wasn't just smiling, she was laughing. Not the gentle, nervous laugh of someone trying to ease tension, but a sharp, almost mocking laugh that cut through the decorum of the courtroom like a knife. His chest tightened. The laughter seemed to echo off the high ceilings, magnified by the oppressive silence surrounding everyone else. Daniel had raised Emily, nurtured her, protected her, and supported her education, her dreams, and her early adulthood. And now, at a moment when he should have expected even the faintest shred of respect, he was met with derision, from his own daughter. Worse still, his son-in-law, Michael, refused to look at him. Michael's posture was rigid, almost aggressively indifferent. His eyes fixed firmly on some point ahead, avoiding Daniel completely. There was no subtle apology, no fleeting glance of acknowledgement, only the cold absence of recognition, as if Daniel's presence carried nothing but inconvenience. The combination of Emily's laughter and Michael's avoidance struck Daniel harder than any insult could have. Daniel had expected tension, he had braced himself for legal arguments, for challenges, for difficult negotiations, but he had not anticipated the personal betrayal, the emotional sting that cut far deeper than any legal complication. He could feel the eyes of others in the courtroom, curious, attentive, aware that something unspoken simmered beneath the surface. He wondered who among them had noticed Emily's laughter, who had picked up on Michael's subtle disdain. Each glance, each whisper, seemed to intensify the humiliation. The memory of the days leading to this moment flooded his mind. Emily and Michael had become increasingly distant over the past months, their dismissive behavior subtle at first, growing into an unmistakable pattern. Invitations ignored, casual remarks undermining his decisions, gestures that implied superiority or condescension. Daniel had attempted to maintain decorum, to approach the situation with calm reasoning, but each effort seemed to be met with derision, a faint smirk, or a laugh that carried the weight of contempt. Now, seated on the wooden bench, Daniel felt a mix of rage and helplessness. The law required civility, the courtroom demanded restraint. But inside, the desire for acknowledgement, for respect, for a subtle but undeniable lesson in humility, burned fiercely. How could his own daughter, raised with love and care, act with such blatant disregard for his feelings? How could Michael, who had promised partnership and family, turn away as if Daniel's presence were a minor inconvenience, not a father-in-law seeking justice or fairness? Daniel's mind raced. There was no immediate opportunity to respond in kind, the courtroom would not tolerate outbursts, and any visible expression of his anger might undermine his position. Yet the fire within him grew, fueled not by impulse but by the recognition that subtle, calculated action would yield far greater satisfaction than raw confrontation. He recalled the lessons he had learned over decades: patience, planning, strategy, and the power of subtle influence. The humiliation he endured now would not be met with vengeance at the moment, but with careful, deliberate planning. There would be no shouting matches, no bitter arguments, instead, a demonstration, precise, impactful, and undeniable, that would restore balance without compromising his dignity. The legal proceedings began, voices measured, arguments polite yet pointed. Daniel listened, careful to maintain composure, aware that every word, every glance, every reaction would be noted. Emily's laughter returned occasionally, quieter now but still edged with condescension, while Michael remained a rigid figure, refusing to meet his gaze. Each moment reinforced the growing desire within Daniel, not for impulsive retaliation, but for a resolution that would assert respect, command acknowledgement, and deliver subtle but lasting psychological impact. As the hearing stretched on, Daniel's mind shifted from humiliation to strategy. He considered ways to regain control, ways to make his presence undeniable, ways to allow truth and competence to speak louder than mockery or avoidance. Every subtle gesture of Emily's derision, every act of Michael's avoidance, became data for the plan forming in his mind. He did not seek to harm, he sought balance, recognition, and a demonstration that disregard and mockery cannot undermine integrity when met with intelligence, patience, and calculated action. By the time the judge called for a recess, Daniel had made a silent vow. He would not let this moment pass unnoticed. He would reclaim dignity, assert authority, and reveal truths in a way that was undeniable, subtle, and morally sound. The humiliation at the entrance, the laughter, and the avoidance had ignited a determination that was neither impulsive nor reckless. It was deliberate, strategic, and focused. As he stepped out of the courtroom for a brief recess, Daniel felt a strange combination of tension and clarity. The fire of anger had been transformed into a tool for careful planning. He understood that revenge, when guided by patience and moral integrity, could achieve far more than immediate confrontation ever could. Emily's laughter and Michael's indifference were no longer simply sources of pain, they were catalysts for reflection, strategy, and ultimately, subtle vindication. In that moment, Daniel's mind began to chart the path forward, a series of calculated actions, ethical but impactful, designed to restore balance, command acknowledgement, and create a lasting impression. This was not about humiliation or malice, it was about asserting truth, reclaiming dignity, and demonstrating that mockery and avoidance, no matter how casual, carry consequences that cannot be ignored. The first part of this journey had ended with humiliation, but it had also sparked a transformation. Daniel knew that the path ahead would require patience, careful planning, and moral clarity. He had faced betrayal, personal insult, and emotional strain, but the next chapter would be one of strategy, resilience, and the subtle, undeniable power of truth. After the courtroom ordeal, Daniel Thompson found himself trapped in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The sting of humiliation lingered, yet beneath it simmered something more potent, the desire to reclaim his dignity, to assert his worth, and to deliver a subtle, undeniable lesson to both his daughter Emily and his son-in-law Michael. This was not about vengeance in the impulsive sense. Daniel knew that raw anger often leads to fleeting satisfaction and lasting regret. What he sought now was precision, strategy, and a demonstration of integrity that could not be ignored. The first step was reflection. Daniel retreated to the quiet of his study, a room filled with the familiar scent of books, polished wood, and the faint aroma of evening tea. He sat in his favorite leather chair, notebook in hand, and began to catalogue every slight, every gesture, and every moment of derision he had experienced over the past months. Emily's laughter in the courtroom, Michael's avoidance, the subtle undermining comments during family gatherings, each incident became a data point, a puzzle piece in the larger picture of their attitudes toward him. Daniel understood that revenge, if poorly executed, could compromise his principles. He had always prided himself on integrity, fairness, and measured judgment. He could act impulsively, storm into the next family gathering or confront them publicly, but such actions would not only tarnish his reputation but also diminish the power of the lesson he intended to teach. Instead, he began to craft a plan that balanced moral clarity with psychological impact, ensuring that the eventual outcome would be undeniable, yet free from cruelty. The process of planning became almost meditative. Daniel wrote lists of objectives: assert dignity, demonstrate competence, correct assumptions, and create a lasting impression without crossing into malice. He considered the timing of each action, the audience, and the subtle ways in which the truth could manifest. Public displays of anger would achieve nothing. Instead, he envisioned scenarios where observation, patience, and evidence would allow the consequences of arrogance and mockery to speak for themselves. Yet the emotional struggle was far from simple. Every reflection brought a surge of anger, a flash of hurt that reminded him of the courtroom scene. Emily, his daughter, whose laughter had cut so deeply, was also someone he loved and had raised with care. Michael, her husband, who refused even the slightest acknowledgement, represented a betrayal not only of respect but of the family bonds Daniel had helped nurture. Balancing the desire for retribution with the love he still felt for his daughter required careful moral navigation. Daniel began to examine the psychological dimension of revenge. He recognized that the satisfaction he sought was not simply punitive but restorative. He wanted acknowledgement, respect, and a subtle correction of assumptions, a quiet revelation that his worth and competence could not be dismissed. The act of revenge would therefore not target them with humiliation, but rather allow them to witness his capabilities and achievements in a manner so clear that denial would be impossible. He also contemplated the broader consequences of his actions. Impulsive retaliation could fracture family bonds permanently. A calculated, ethical approach could assert authority and dignity without creating unnecessary animosity. He understood that revenge executed with patience and moral clarity has a ripple effect. It not only addresses the immediate slight but also establishes boundaries, reinforces self-respect, and communicates principles without resorting to aggression. Daniel spent days meticulously crafting his approach. He considered public and private settings, opportunities for subtle demonstration, and ways to convey competence and integrity. He thought about casual family gatherings, professional events where Michael and Emily might be present, and social circles where their assumptions could be corrected naturally. Every scenario was weighed carefully, assessing impact, timing, and potential repercussions. In parallel, he worked on his own personal growth. The courtroom incident, painful as it was, had sparked a deeper reflection on his life, accomplishments, and the way he projected authority. Daniel realized that part of the satisfaction he sought from revenge came from a desire to assert his own identity, beyond the shadow of familial derision. He began documenting his achievements, organizing evidence of his contributions, and preparing to present his accomplishments in a subtle yet undeniable manner. The planning process also required Daniel to grapple with the emotional complexity of confronting loved ones. Could he deliver a lesson without engendering resentment? Could he assert his worth without alienating his daughter permanently? These questions became central to his strategy. He decided that the most effective form of correction would be indirect, a situation where truth, competence, and integrity would naturally reveal themselves, leaving Emily and Michael to process the lesson internally rather than through confrontation. During late-night reflection sessions, Daniel considered various methods. He could organize a professional showcase of his achievements, allowing others to observe his competence and subtly witness the contrast between their assumptions and reality. He could leverage social gatherings to display skill, intelligence, and resourcefulness, making the point through action rather than words. Each scenario emphasized subtlety, ethical grounding, and the psychological power of observation. Simultaneously, Daniel trained himself to maintain composure in the presence of Emily and Michael. Every encounter became an opportunity to practice restraint, measured expression, and quiet authority. He understood that the ultimate impact would not come from dramatic gestures but from consistent demonstration of dignity and competence. He reminded himself that anger could cloud judgment, but patience and strategy would amplify effect. As the weeks passed, Daniel refined his plan. He envisioned the sequence of events in his mind, rehearsing interactions, anticipating reactions, and adjusting strategies. He recognized that the key to effective revenge lay not in the act itself but in the psychological engagement it created, forcing Emily and Michael to confront their own assumptions, recognize the consequences of their behavior, and internalize the lesson without overt confrontation. Daniel's internal struggle persisted. He oscillated between the urge for immediate recognition and the understanding that true impact required patience. The temptation to act impulsively, to confront, scold, or expose, was always present, yet he resisted it with careful discipline. He realized that moral clarity, strategic thinking, and subtle execution would yield far greater satisfaction than impulsive retaliation ever could. In private moments, Daniel imagined their reactions, Emily's laughter replaced by silent realization, Michael's avoidance giving way to reluctant acknowledgement. These mental rehearsals were not fantasies of humiliation but exercises in emotional projection, helping him to anticipate outcomes, refine his approach, and maintain ethical grounding. Ultimately, Daniel resolved to let the situation unfold naturally, guided by careful planning, subtlety, and moral integrity. The act of revenge would not be a spectacle but a quiet, undeniable assertion of competence, worth, and dignity. It would not be driven by malice, but by a desire to restore balance, command respect, and allow Emily and Michael to recognize their own misjudgments without direct confrontation. By the end of this planning phase, Daniel felt a growing sense of purpose. The humiliation of the courtroom had transformed from a source of pain into a catalyst for strategic, ethical action. He had charted a path forward that balanced emotional satisfaction with moral clarity, ensuring that the eventual outcome would be both impactful and just. The internal struggle had forged a resolution. Revenge would come, not as a lash of anger, but as a demonstration of competence and dignity so undeniable that it could not be ignored. The lesson for Emily and Michael would unfold naturally, allowing them to witness the consequences of their behavior while preserving the integrity of family bonds and the moral compass that guided Daniel's actions. In that quiet, disciplined determination, Daniel found a sense of empowerment. The path ahead was clear: patience, strategy, and subtle execution would transform humiliation into vindication, mockery into acknowledgement, and betrayal into a profound lesson in respect and integrity. Weeks of meticulous preparation had led Daniel Thompson to this moment. The subtle strategy he had been refining in private, balancing dignity, patience, and psychological insight, was about to unfold. Unlike impulsive reactions, this plan relied on observation, timing, and the undeniable demonstration of competence and personal achievement. Daniel felt a tense anticipation as he dressed for the occasion: a tailored suit, polished shoes, and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent months preparing not for spectacle, but for impact. The setting was a family gathering, organized to celebrate a mutual friend's professional achievement. It was casual enough to avoid immediate suspicion but public enough to ensure that Daniel's presence and actions could not go unnoticed. Guests mingled, conversations flowed, and the soft hum of music underscored polite laughter. Emily and Michael arrived together, as expected, their demeanor initially unaffected by Daniel's entrance. Emily's smile held traces of amusement, the faint echo of her courtroom laughter, while Michael maintained his characteristic indifference, refusing to meet Daniel's gaze. Daniel moved through the crowd with measured composure, acknowledging acquaintances politely, exchanging handshakes, and engaging in brief, thoughtful conversation. Every gesture was deliberate, designed to convey calm authority and understated confidence. He knew that the power of his plan would not come from grand declarations or dramatic confrontation, but from the quiet yet undeniable projection of self-worth. The first step in his strategy was subtle observation. Daniel noted Emily's behavior, the subtle eye rolls, the occasional smirk, and Michael's steadfast avoidance. These patterns reinforced his understanding that direct confrontation was unnecessary. The lesson would be revealed through indirect means. The plan required patience, a careful orchestration of actions that allowed truth, competence, and presence to speak louder than words ever could. Daniel then initiated a series of strategic interactions designed to highlight his expertise and accomplishments. At one corner of the gathering, he engaged in conversation with mutual friends about a recent project he had successfully completed. He shared insights, problem-solving strategies, and thoughtful analyses, all delivered without arrogance or condescension. The effect was immediate. Guests began to listen attentively, nodding in acknowledgement, asking questions, and subtly reinforcing Daniel's competence. Emily's laughter, once a sharp symbol of mockery, began to fade. Her attention, initially fleeting and amused, now shifted toward genuine curiosity and, quietly, a dawning recognition. She had assumed that Daniel's presence was inconsequential, that his role in professional and social contexts was minor. As she listened, witnessing the depth of his knowledge, the clarity of his reasoning, and the understated elegance of his approach, the assumptions she had held began to unravel. Michael, too, could not escape the quiet impact of Daniel's demonstration. Though his posture remained rigid and his gaze often fixed elsewhere, the subtle acknowledgement of Daniel's competence was unavoidable. Mutual acquaintances glanced toward Daniel, nodding appreciatively, which made the social dynamic shift in ways Michael could not control. The lesson was unfolding organically, through observation and recognition rather than confrontation or humiliation. Daniel then subtly extended an invitation for collaboration on a community initiative, a project that required strategic insight, organizational skill, and leadership. The offer was casual, polite, and entirely professional, yet its implications were clear. It demonstrated that Daniel's capabilities were not theoretical but practical, actionable, and recognized by others. Guests noted the interaction, Emily and Michael could not ignore it, and Daniel's quiet authority was now established without a single word directed at retribution. Throughout the evening, Daniel maintained his composure, resisting the temptation to comment on Emily's prior behavior or Michael's avoidance. Every interaction, every conversation, and every acknowledgement was a calculated step in the demonstration of dignity and competence. The psychological effect was profound. Emily's smirk softened into tentative recognition, Michael's rigid indifference wavered, and the room subtly aligned with the unspoken truth of Daniel's capabilities. At one point, a casual remark from a mutual acquaintance prompted a brief discussion about leadership, strategy, and professional integrity. Daniel contributed insightfully, weaving examples from his experience with clarity and humility. The room quieted in attention, and Emily's laughter, once a symbol of dismissal, vanished entirely. Her eyes reflected surprise, a dawning understanding, and, quietly, the realization that her assumptions had been flawed. Michael, observing the interactions, could no longer sustain his avoidance. Though he did not openly acknowledge Daniel, subtle cues, a shift in posture, a brief glance, the slight softening of his expression, betrayed the impact of the quiet demonstration. Daniel's plan was succeeding not through direct confrontation, but through the undeniable evidence of competence, integrity, and moral authority. The climax unfolded in a single, unremarkable moment. Daniel shared a solution to a logistical challenge in the community initiative, a solution that was elegant, effective, and immediately recognized by those present. Emily's expression shifted fully, her amusement replaced by reflective acknowledgement, while Michael could not avoid the collective recognition from the gathered group. The lesson was clear: disregard and mockery cannot diminish true competence, and subtle, ethically grounded action carries a resonance far more powerful than impulsive retaliation. In this moment, Daniel realized a profound truth about revenge: it is most satisfying when it is constructive, morally sound, and focused on restoring balance rather than causing harm. The humiliation he had endured, the laughter of his daughter, and the avoidance of his son-in-law had all been transformed into catalysts for strategic, ethical action. The outcome was undeniable: recognition, acknowledgement, and the restoration of dignity, yet achieved without cruelty or spectacle. Daniel felt a quiet surge of satisfaction, not from witnessing embarrassment or pain, but from the knowledge that his approach had worked as intended. He had demonstrated worth, competence, and moral clarity. Emily and Michael, confronted indirectly with the consequences of their assumptions and behavior, were now forced to reckon with reality in a manner that encouraged reflection rather than resentment. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel walked away from the gathering with a sense of calm triumph. The plan, crafted through patience, strategy, and ethical consideration, had succeeded. The laughter, avoidance, and subtle derision were now replaced with quiet acknowledgement, reflective awareness, and the restoration of balance. Daniel had achieved the ultimate form of revenge, the assertion of truth and integrity in a way that could not be denied, minimized, or dismissed. In that final moment, he understood that true power lies not in confrontation or malice, but in subtlety, patience, and moral authority. Revenge, when guided by intelligence and ethical consideration, becomes a tool for restoration, reflection, and personal empowerment. Daniel had transformed humiliation into vindication, mockery into acknowledgement, and emotional pain into a constructive demonstration of competence, integrity, and dignity. The gathering had ended hours ago, yet the effects lingered like a quiet echo in Daniel Thompson's mind. The demonstration of his competence and dignity had been subtle, carefully orchestrated, and entirely ethical, yet its impact was undeniable. Emily's laughter, once a symbol of derision, had been replaced by tentative acknowledgement. Michael's rigid avoidance had softened, though he remained cautiously reserved. Daniel walked home that evening with a sense of calm satisfaction, tempered by introspection rather than euphoria. He sat in the quiet of his study, reflecting on the events of the evening. The reactions of those around him, mutual friends, colleagues, and family acquaintances, had validated his approach. Conversations he had initiated, solutions he had offered, and insights he had shared were now subjects of subtle admiration. Yet Daniel understood that the true significance of the night was not in external recognition, but in the personal mastery he had exercised over his emotions, patience, and moral compass. Emily, his daughter, had become the focus of his reflection. The sight of her tentative expressions, a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and dawning respect, struck a chord deep within him. He had loved her since the day she was born, and her laughter in the courtroom had wounded him precisely because it came from someone he cherished. Yet, the evening had allowed for a transformation, one in which understanding, acknowledgement, and subtle reconciliation were possible without confrontation or forced apology. Michael, his son-in-law, presented a different dynamic. His avoidance in the courtroom had been a stark reminder of perceived indifference, perhaps even arrogance. Yet, throughout the evening, Daniel had observed subtle shifts, a softening in posture, a fleeting glance of acknowledgement, and the realization that social dynamics had rendered his previous dismissiveness ineffective. Daniel recognized that the most powerful form of influence does not rely on coercion but on natural, undeniable demonstration. In the days that followed, Daniel noticed changes in family interactions. Emily, though initially awkward, began to treat him with a quiet respect, her previous amusement tempered by reflective awareness. She asked for his advice on small matters, sought his opinion on decisions, and displayed a subtle curiosity about his experiences and insights. Michael, while still measured and reserved, occasionally acknowledged Daniel's contributions with polite affirmation, a far cry from the rigid avoidance that had dominated prior interactions. The psychological impact on Daniel himself was profound. The humiliation of the courtroom, once a source of simmering anger, had been transformed into a catalyst for personal growth and strategic mastery. He had learned to channel emotional pain into calculated, ethical action, demonstrating that dignity, competence, and integrity could achieve far more than impulsive retaliation. The experience reinforced the understanding that true satisfaction comes not from witnessing humiliation or exacting revenge, but from asserting one's worth and maintaining moral authority. Daniel also reflected on the subtle ripple effect of his actions. Friends and colleagues who had observed his demonstration began to regard him with renewed appreciation. His approach had not only corrected assumptions but it also established a model for navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. Patience, moral clarity, and subtle, strategic influence can achieve resolution without conflict. The lesson extended beyond Emily and Michael, influencing perceptions and interactions across a broader social spectrum. At the same time, Daniel considered the ongoing dynamics within his family. He realized that while the demonstration had been effective, genuine reconciliation required patience, understanding, and continued ethical engagement. He could not demand acknowledgement or force reflection. Instead, he needed to maintain consistent integrity, allowing Emily and Michael to internalize the lessons at their own pace. True influence, he recognized, emerges through sustained character and thoughtful action, not through confrontation or coercion. He also grappled with lingering emotional complexity. The desire for revenge, while satisfied in its strategic execution, had revealed deeper layers of relational tension, unmet expectations, and emotional vulnerability. Daniel acknowledged that personal growth is intertwined with relational maturity, that the ability to transform pain into constructive action is as much an emotional achievement as it is a strategic one. In quiet moments, Daniel reflected on the power of subtlety. The courtroom humiliation, Emily's laughter, and Michael's avoidance had all been catalysts, yet the ultimate resolution had been achieved not through overt confrontation, but through indirect, ethically grounded demonstration. He understood that the most profound lessons often emerge from observation, reflection, and recognition rather than through dramatic displays or punishment. The aftermath also provided insight into human behavior. Daniel observed how assumptions, dismissiveness, and superficial judgments can blind individuals to truth and competence. Emily's laughter and Michael's avoidance had been rooted in such assumptions, and the evening had allowed them to confront these misjudgments organically. This reinforced Daniel's belief that ethical, patient, and strategic action can correct misconceptions and restore balance without creating unnecessary conflict or resentment. Emotionally, Daniel experienced a sense of closure. The sting of previous humiliation had transformed into quiet empowerment, a reaffirmation of his values, capabilities, and moral compass. He felt a deeper understanding of his own resilience, the importance of patience, and the power of integrity. The desire for revenge had been met not with impulsive retaliation, but with thoughtful, deliberate action that reinforced his dignity and self-respect. He also noted a subtle shift in his internal dialogue. The need for external validation had lessened, satisfaction now derived from knowing that he had acted with clarity, purpose, and ethical precision. The experience had cultivated a new confidence, one grounded in moral authority rather than ego, and it reshaped his approach to future conflicts, both within family dynamics and broader social interactions. Emily and Michael, over the following weeks, continued to adjust. Emily approached Daniel with quiet questions about decision-making, strategy, and problem-solving, while Michael offered occasional, restrained acknowledgement of his insights. The subtle acknowledgement they now extended was far more meaningful than any overt apology or dramatic gesture could have been. Daniel understood that the power of influence lies in consistency, integrity, and the undeniable demonstration of truth rather than an immediate confrontation. In the final reflection of this aftermath, Daniel considered the moral dimensions of his journey. Revenge, when guided by ethics, patience, and strategic insight, becomes a tool for restoration rather than destruction. The humiliation he had endured was not erased but transformed into an opportunity for empowerment, learning, and the assertion of self-worth. The lesson extended beyond family dynamics, highlighting the profound impact of integrity, patience, and thoughtful action in resolving interpersonal conflict. By the end of this reflective period, Daniel felt a sense of balance. The emotional turbulence that had once dominated his thoughts was replaced by calm satisfaction, strategic clarity, and moral authority. The subtle, indirect lesson delivered to Emily and Michael had achieved its intended effect, restoring dignity, asserting competence, and fostering reflective acknowledgement. Daniel's internal transformation was complete. He had converted humiliation into empowerment, mockery into reflection, and the desire for revenge into constructive action. The experience reinforced the understanding that true resolution emerges not from confrontation or malice, but from patience, strategy, and the quiet yet undeniable demonstration of integrity. As he closed his notebook that evening, Daniel felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The journey from courtroom humiliation to strategic vindication had been arduous, yet it had illuminated the principles of patience, morality, and subtle influence. He understood now that revenge, when executed ethically and thoughtfully, can restore balance, command respect, and leave lasting impact without compromising one's values or relationships. In the quiet aftermath, Daniel Thompson had discovered the ultimate lesson, that dignity, competence, and moral clarity are far more powerful than laughter, avoidance, or derision, and that the true measure of influence lies not in punishing others, but in asserting truth and integrity with quiet authority. Months had passed since the carefully orchestrated family gathering where Daniel Thompson had demonstrated his competence, dignity, and moral authority. The memory of that night, the subtle yet undeniable impact it had created, remained vivid in his mind, not as a source of prideful arrogance, but as a testament to patience, strategic thinking, and ethical resilience. Daniel's relationship with his daughter Emily had shifted in quiet, meaningful ways. She no longer laughed in derision or dismissed his presence. Instead, she approached him with curiosity, respect, and the tentative desire to understand his experiences and insights. The transformation was subtle, but profound. Emily had begun to recognize the value of listening, the weight of unspoken competence, and the consequences of casual mockery. Each interaction with her now carried a new depth, reflecting a balance between familial love and reflective acknowledgement. Michael, though still reserved, exhibited similar shifts. His avoidance had softened into measured acknowledgement. He asked questions about Daniel's decisions, occasionally sought advice, and, without overt expression, demonstrated respect for the father-in-law he had once subtly dismissed. Daniel understood that true change in human behavior is rarely immediate or dramatic. It manifests slowly, through observation, reflection, and repeated exposure to consistent moral clarity. The emotional impact on Daniel himself was equally significant. The humiliation he had endured in the courtroom, once a source of acute pain and simmering anger, had been transformed into an opportunity for growth. By channeling his desire for revenge into ethical, deliberate, and strategic action, he had achieved a resolution that was deeply satisfying without compromising his integrity. He had not sought to humiliate Emily or Michael, rather, he had created circumstances where the truth of his competence and dignity became undeniable. Daniel's reflections extended beyond personal vindication. He considered the broader lessons embedded in the experience. Mockery, avoidance, and dismissive behavior, though initially painful, had served as catalysts for self-mastery, strategic thinking, and ethical assertion. The incident reinforced his understanding that revenge, when guided by impulse and emotion, often perpetuates conflict. Conversely, when approached with patience, moral clarity, and subtle strategy, it can restore balance, command respect, and yield lasting psychological satisfaction. He also recognized the delicate interplay between personal growth and relational dynamics. While he had successfully asserted his worth and corrected misjudgments, genuine reconciliation required ongoing patience and consistency. Emily and Michael needed time to internalize the lessons, and Daniel understood that forcing acknowledgement or confrontation would undermine the subtle power of the demonstration. True influence, he realized, emerges from quiet authority, consistent behavior, and the natural consequences of observable competence. In this period of reflection, Daniel also considered the personal transformation that had occurred within himself. The desire for revenge, once raw and emotionally charged, had been refined into strategic, principled action. He had learned to navigate complex emotional landscapes, balancing love, patience, and ethical considerations against the desire to restore personal dignity. The process had strengthened his self-respect, deepened his understanding of human behavior, and enhanced his capacity for measured decision-making. Family interactions, over the ensuing months, reflected these subtle but meaningful shifts. Emily approached decisions with greater thoughtfulness, occasionally seeking Daniel's input and acknowledging his insights in ways that were understated yet significant. Michael, while maintaining his reserved demeanor, exhibited restrained acknowledgement of Daniel's influence, subtly affirming the effectiveness of the strategy without verbalizing it overtly. Daniel observed these changes without overt satisfaction, understanding that true recognition is most powerful when it emerges organically rather than being demanded. The experience also prompted Daniel to reflect on the broader implications of his approach. He considered how ethical, strategic, and patient action can transform potentially destructive desires for revenge into constructive opportunities for personal growth and relational improvement. By channeling emotional energy into deliberate, morally grounded actions, he had demonstrated that influence and authority are most enduring when exercised with integrity rather than aggression. Daniel's reflections extended to the notion of emotional resilience. The humiliation of the courtroom, the laughter of his daughter, and the avoidance of his son-in-law had all been emotionally taxing, yet they had catalyzed a process of introspection, strategic planning, and moral assertion. He realized that adversity, when approached with patience, reflection, and ethical clarity, can become a powerful teacher, shaping behavior, reinforcing values, and cultivating enduring satisfaction. In private moments, Daniel considered the nature of acknowledgement and respect. He recognized that both are earned through consistent demonstration of competence, integrity, and moral authority rather than through coercion or confrontation. The evening at the family gathering, the subtle shifts in Emily and Michael, and the broader recognition of his abilities collectively reinforced this principle. The most satisfying form of vindication, he concluded, is not reactive or aggressive but proactive, subtle, and ethically grounded. The moral clarity that Daniel achieved also reshaped his perspective on interpersonal dynamics. He understood that mockery and avoidance, while initially painful, often reflect assumptions, insecurities, or lack of awareness. By responding with patience, strategic action, and ethical authority, he had corrected misperceptions without causing harm, establishing a model for engagement that prioritized dignity, reflection, and long-term impact over immediate gratification. As Daniel continued to observe his family, he noted that the lessons of the gathering had endured. Emily's humor, once edged with derision, had transformed into curiosity, respect, and the occasional playful acknowledgement of her own misjudgments. Michael's avoidance had given way to subtle cooperation, measured engagement, and the recognition that Daniel's presence carried weight, insight, and authority. These changes, quiet yet profound, represented the lasting impact of strategic, morally grounded action. Ultimately, Daniel found closure not in dramatic displays or overt punishment, but in the quiet satisfaction of having acted with integrity, intelligence, and patience. The journey from courtroom humiliation to subtle vindication had reinforced his understanding of human behavior, the principles of ethical influence, and the enduring power of dignity. He had transformed personal pain into strategic opportunity, emotional turbulence into thoughtful action, and the desire for revenge into a constructive demonstration of self-respect and moral authority. The final lesson, one that Daniel carried forward with deep awareness, was clear: revenge, when guided by patience, ethical clarity, and strategic insight, can restore balance, assert dignity, and create lasting impact without causing harm. Mockery and avoidance, though painful, can catalyze growth, reflection, and subtle correction. True satisfaction arises not from retaliation but from principled action, consistent integrity, and the quiet but undeniable demonstration of competence and self-respect. As Daniel closed the chapter on this experience, he felt a profound sense of empowerment, calm, and moral clarity. The laughter of his daughter and the avoidance of his son-in-law had been transformed into lessons in patience, strategy, and ethical vindication. He understood that true influence lies not in confrontation or malice, but in measured, morally grounded action that restores balance, fosters reflection, and preserves dignity. In this quiet resolution, Daniel Thompson had not only reclaimed his self-respect but had subtly reshaped the relational dynamics around him. He had proven, without drama or malice, that integrity, competence, and moral clarity are far more powerful than mockery, avoidance, or dismissal. The journey had ended not with spectacle, but with enduring understanding, reflective acknowledgement, and the profound satisfaction of having acted with both patience and principle.